Thank you for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
Awesome. So here's one, number 4, not knowing how to properly scaffold in training. This is one in particular that I'm really passionate about. Mm-hmm. And I wrote it down as doing too much too soon, but I'm going to add to this. When you don't know how to properly scaffold in training, I notice that trainers either do too much too soon or they do too little too late. I think that that's just as likely. I find all the time that newer trainers, they make this mistake. When we say not knowing how to scaffold properly, we're talking about not being able to push the dogs through their phases in training. A quick example. The ultimate goal is I want to take my dog off leash, go for hikes, yada, 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 right? Runyon Canyon. I love that place. Trainers either make this mistake. They do 2-3 lessons in the house. Then they do 2-3 lessons in the front yard. Then they go for Runyon Canyon. And of course, the dog is struggling, way too overstimulated, way too distracted, yada, yada, yada. Or you sign up the dog for a 3, 4, 5 week board and train program. And you don't take the dog out to Runyon Canyon until like 3 days before they go home.
Yeah,
true. Things like that. Or at least to the steps up. It's house, Runyon. It's not like house, slowly more distracting, and so on. Now, this one is something that really I find myself very passionate about, because when we were talking to Tyler and we were talking to a lot of the, like Michael, a lot of the guys that are more analytical about training, we were talking about the process, how important the process is of finding out what the difficulties are from the dog's perspective. Why are you so distracted? Is it that squirrel? Is it the dog? Is it this? Is this? And if you go from the house with no dogs in it to the mall with like 14,000 people in it and some dogs, you have no idea what it's. Is it the smell of the food? Is it the noises? Is it the, so you have to be able to scaffold things in such a way that you can more or less pinpoint what the difficulties are. Oh, you're scared of the shopping cart. Oh, you're scared of the, the big wheel ladder things at Home Depot. Oh, so that we can work through them accordingly. Because if not, people tend to throw the dog in there all at once. Really, either way, even if you're doing too much too soon or too little too late, when you're doing too little too late, you still rush the end of it. So the dog's still getting tossed in too quickly.
Right.
And they just don't know how to cope, which means you're probably going to overhandle them in order to make up for their lack of like obedience, which means the dog's going to shut down, which means he's just more afraid of the Home Depot thing now.
Yep. And that's all kind of, in like back again, when I was a compulsion trainer, there was a lot of really shitty scaffolding. It'd be like, okay, dog learned how to sit. Bring out the squeakers.
Right. Bring out the basketball, the skateboard.
Bring out the skate. Oh, the dog's in for chasing skateboards. All right, dog knows how to sit now. Bring out the skateboard.
Right.
And let's crank and yank on this. And kind of like what you were talking about earlier with the cattle dog, right? He just put the e-collar on the dog and took him out and said, all right, we're gonna go zap the shit out of this dog. So it is definitely scaffolding is super duper important for there to be understanding, right? And there are some behaviors that we know, and it's contextual, and a good dog trainer can read it, but that you can just nip, right? There are certain behaviors you can just nip, but for sustainability, there has to be a certain level of expectation that gradually grows and gets stronger, and then you take that to Runyon Canyon or the park.
Right. And I want to add this, like we talked about earlier when we were talking about the importance of learning various methods, right? Even if it's for the same drill, food, or rather, sits for food, leash, whatever, e-collar. I'm gonna add that same importance into scaffolding, because
I'll tell you this, R+ work, positive reinforcement work, taught me scaffolding in a beautiful way, in the shaping of things, in the close approximations of stuff. That's why I will always love the R+ world, because they are master scaffolders. What is it that Sarah Brewski said? She said, a lot of people are they say people are constantly, or in balance training, people are constantly trying to control the dog.
Right. Versus in R+ training, people are controlling the circumstance around the dog
or the environment. Yeah.
Right.
And I thought that was so cool, because in R+ training, it's like they are controlling more variables that are not the dog to make the dog more successful.
Exactly.
Right? Versus we're constantly in balance training, we're constantly trying to control the dog and leaving the environments uncontrolled. You
Right.
know, not all the time, but that's a common mistake that we can make. Cool. Great point. Go ahead.
Yeah. And I think that, since you bring up R plus training, I agree with you, number one, that for shaping behaviors, it's hard to beat. I learned R plus training. I mean, I learned it in a combination of ways, working with like puppies. Puppies tend to be a lot of sport dogs, so they still need to learn their stuff. They still need to go through their food work. But the point that I was making was there's a reason why scaffolding is what it is. There's a reason why you don't just put the collar on the dog who just learned it and then bring the skateboard out and fuck him up when he's after the skateboard. Because I tell people this all the time. Depending on how you're working the particular lesson, like, calm patterning with place, calm patterning with down versus food work, place and down, sometimes you're teaching more than just the command. Sometimes you're teaching the importance of focus. Sometimes you're teaching the importance of drive and really earning the reward and engagement and communication. Sometimes you're teaching patience. Sometimes you're teaching the value in letting something go when it's not necessarily important or beneficial for them to focus on that thing, i.e. the skateboard, even though a sit is a sit. So when you're scaffolding, you have to take that into account. You don't just you wouldn't just write out a training program from a scaffolding perspective. Like, first I'm going to teach sit, then I'm going to teach down, then I'm going to teach heel, then I'm going to teach place. You write it out like, first I'm going to teach the dog the importance of communicating with me. Then I'm going to teach the dog why it's fun to communicate with me. I want to build some drive. I want to have some fun. I want to build some work ethic, focus. Then I'm going to start teaching the dog how to be patient. Then I'm going to start getting into socializing. Then, so scaffolding works in a different way than people tend to think. And I just wanted to point that out as to why you go, why would you bother if the end result is to go to Runyon Canyon and heel off leash? You can get there, but first you got to go, you take the puppy through the understandings of, this is why this stuff is what it is. Then we can step into, level 2, level 3, and so on.
Right. And there is another thing that you mentioned, and sometimes it is possible that the dog can adapt, but let's say you work in the house for 3 days, you work in the front yard for 2 days, and then you start doing the next 2.5 weeks at Runyon. Right. So can the dog adjust? For sure. Can the dog eventually get better and progressively, just can you develop what you want to develop at Runyon? Of course.
Right.
But you could also develop some bad habits in the process.
Right. I want to ask you something. I'm sticking to your point, but I want to ask you this way.
Yeah.
Because if the question is, can the dog, like if you take the dog out there, will the dog adapt? The answer is almost certainly yes. That's why dogs are so amazing. However, in order to get that dog to adapt in that particular scenario where you took him out there too soon, did you stress the dog way more than you had to?
Yes.
And if the answer to that is yes, would you consider that a successful training program?
No. So that's the point I was getting at. Yeah.
Okay.
Good thing. Yeah. So would the dog adapt? And my point is if you did go for the next 2.5 weeks to that hiking trail where there's all those crazy distractions, the dog will have to now be reliant on the correction or the excessive reinforcement that you had to put on them to be able to listen in a particular situation like that. Right. And so you were going to say something. I thought you were going to say something. You said we are not only teaching the dog, drive and all that stuff, but we're also teaching state of mind.
Correct. Right.
That's something too. And so
that's what I was getting at with the food work. You're teaching drive. Calm, patterning, relaxation, focus, long duration stuff. You're teaching calmer state of mind.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's also something that you can I get a dog to, just again, even if when we go back to shitty scaffolding back when I was more of a compulsion trainer, I would demo dogs for clients and their tails would be tucked between their legs,
right?
And that's because we would actually do, I would end up falling into the second form of shitty scaffolding, which was I had 4 weeks with a dog and I didn't push the dog until week 3.
Right.
You know what I mean? So there was kind of this extra pressure that was being put on the dog because he was about to go home 3 or 4 days before his graduation date. Right. And so that's, I think that's the downside of having a time limit with a dog for sure. It's really easy to get exhausted and procrastinate and do all those types of things, which isn't fair to the dogs, right? At all.
Right. And I wanted to bring this up too. This is something that this is a little sub point that I'm also very, very much like passionate about direct versus indirect reps and the benefit. And what I mean is this: whenever we have a dog, let's say a dog comes in. So the dog that I'm talking about, that I was talking about earlier, the cattle dog, the one that I have currently, the one who's very sensitive to the e-collar. The reason why he's here is because a really sweet, young lady adopted him, let's say a couple months ago at this point. He bit her boyfriend in the face. When I went to meet him, we go for a walk. He's horrible on leash. He's lunging at every single dog he sees. It could be a block away. And I started talking to her about that, the benefit of direct versus indirect attention necessarily. And I gave her this example. For example, if your dog lunges at a person, that's a boundary that I have to set. No, you don't do that. That's a clear and direct challenge to the thing you've just done, so to speak, right? However, there's also a ton, I would say the majority of me getting him to not lunge at people is going to be indirect. I'm not just going to take him around people and correct the shit out of him. I'm going to put him through food work and teach him it's fun to listen to me. You like me. Then I'm going to gradually, at a speed that the dog's comfortable with, slowly start to introduce boundaries. I'm still doing the same job. I'm still decreasing the likelihood of him wanting to lunge at people, especially if I'm around, but it's indirect. I'm not fighting with him every step of the way. And that direct versus indirect, I bring it to scaffolding because yes, I agree. If the goal is to take the dog to Runyon Canyon and then be proficient, you have to get your reps in at Runyon Canyon for them to be proficient. That's direct training. But the indirect training, people love to devalue all the time. Well, if he's biting, I don't really care if he sits or lays down. I just need him to stop biting. And it's like, I understand that, but there's a lot of value in teaching a dog how to sit with food. And then there's a lot of value in teaching the dog to sit with leash. And then, all this stuff is going to help you stop him from biting.
Right. Exactly. Like how do you condition the dog's brain to make better decisions?
Exactly.
Right. And conditioning the dog to make better decisions is sometimes putting them in less stressful situations, not exactly the scenario, but something similar or parallel to, so that way the dog can actually learn the right decision to make. So that when you do take him to Runyon or you do put the skateboard in front of him, he's already can predict what he's supposed to do.
Right. The more we talk about this, the more I'm starting to feel that parallel. Like, you tell me this all the time. Somebody can learn something analytically, but until they feel it, they're not going to really stick with it.
Yeah.
What I'm feeling in this episode this evening is direct is just as important as indirect. However, direct is the balance training. Direct is controlling the dog. The indirect, which again is just as important as the direct, is controlling the environment around the dog to kind of coax them to making the right decision. And I just thought it was fascinating the way that Sarah had broken that down for us, and I also think it's fascinating just how valuable both sides of that coin are.
Yes, 100%. And controlling the dog versus controlling the environment, and how, it's kind of like Blake Rodriguez said. It's funny because we keep referring to the last 8 episodes.
I
know. But like Blake Rodriguez said, it's kind of like we're reflecting on what we've not necessarily learned for the first time, but we've heard other people say again and again and again and again. So it just helps solidify that what as a trainer is correct, because other people that you respect are also doing it as well. And it makes sense for the dog. But what he was saying was, what was it? What was the point? Shit, I just forgot it. What was it?
No worries. Direct versus indirect, balanced versus positive, the dog versus the environment.
Controlling the environment versus controlling the dog.
Right.
Controlling the environment.
I think if I can assume, let's see
what Blake said.
Let's see how well I know you. So I think what you were getting at, because I remember you loved this when he said it, was the way that he explained the conditioning process. We need to know how to get more of something, how to get less of something.
No, that's not it.
Oh, damn.
But anyways, Blake Rodriguez said some dope shit. I will hopefully remember it later. But I forgot what it was. God dang it.
No worries. Well, while you're thinking about that, I want to talk a little bit about honestly gauging the dog's current ability to do things, to learn, to focus. And, and like the reason why I say learn and focus is two separate things is because a lot of times I notice this is something that was fun in military life, right? Like basic training, stuff like that. Things that are meant to stress you on purpose. They know it's going to stress you. And they also know very much why they're doing it. that when people stress, typically they have a harder time in taking information. Dogs are the same way, 100%. Right? It's like two lanes of traffic merging into one. There's stress and there's info, and sometimes that just doesn't quite work out.
Yeah.
The people who can handle it are the people they want, which is why they do it. Dog training is different because the objective isn't to stress the dog out like that per se. Mm-hmm. However, the objective is to find the most efficient, most effective way to stress the dog just to the real standard of what they're going to be doing. If the dog is reactive and nervous outside, I at least need you to learn to be comfortable outside. Or if you get nervous for whatever reason, I just need you to have enough state of mind, like enough presence with you to not make that one decision. Don't bite, don't lunge.
Right. Yeah. And it's kind of, you know, similar to what you said, but, you know, I remember watching some detective show and they were saying like people who have suffered trauma make some of the worst eyewitnesses. Like if you were part of the explosion, or if you were part of the bank robbery, or if you were part of this, and it's because when they're under stress, like they're not processing. It's not necessarily going to a memory because they're in fight or flight mode. And when they're in fight or flight mode, there's not a lot of retention of all the details. Right.
Because it doesn't matter. Just get the fuck out of there.
Get the fuck out of there. Exactly. Right. And so a lot of times when our dogs are anxious or stressed, same thing happens. Right. And it's interesting. I was just working with a client the other day, how, you know, a correction can actually be used to maintain focus.
Right.
In some scenario, if the dog is that scatterbrained or driven, or sometimes even that anxious. Her dog was extremely anxious. 3 or 4 corrections in, the dog's locked in, head appealing, you know, looking at her. She's like, oh, I didn't know that this little world existed. Right. But then sometimes it can have the adverse effect, right? Where it causes too much stress, or now the dog feels they're under attack or whatever it might be. So
correct.
So yeah, I think that's important to see. Is my dog learning? Is my dog not learning?
And I love that you pointed that out, because that's exactly how I was going to kind of tie this back into scaffolding. Honestly, gauge the dog's ability to learn currently. Is the dog, I mean, when we talk about scaffolding, you do have to push the dog. And naturally, just the very nature of pushing, even if that pushing is food work, it's stressful because it's change. It's growth. It's stressful in that good way. But, you know, one thing I like to say about training is like, it's my job in a sense to stress them to a degree. Like the first day of school, it's scary. It is not my job to stress them any more than is absolutely necessary to achieve the desired outcome.
Right.
So if you're honestly gauging the dog's current ability to like intake info, if the dog is too stressed out to learn currently, back off. If the dog is so sharp that they can take a little more on their plate, push it, but gauge these things and find out which is which.
Yeah, 100%.